No one on the base could figure out why the tank wouldn't start. Trained mechanics tried everything. Specialists flew in from across the region. Still, nothing. It wasn't until an aging, long-retired Army engineer showed up at the colonel's request, limping slightly from an old injury, carrying only a worn toolbox, that the impossible happened. What followed wasn't just a lesson in machines, but a revelation about memory, respect, and the quiet brilliance that time too often forgets. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They had dragged the tank out before dawn, the desert winds still cool enough to stave off the relentless summer sun. It was supposed to be a formality, just a final systems check before the scheduled transfer. This particular M1 Abrams was being reassigned from the outpost to a larger base, and as per procedure, everything had to be verified. But what started as a routine inspection quickly turned into an unsolvable problem. When the ignition sequence failed, the mechanics chalked it up to a loose wire. When the diagnostics returned errors that didn't make sense, they assumed it was the software. But after hours of reboots, wire tracing, module replacements, and failed jump starts, the problem deepened. The tank remained inert, unmoved, as if it had grown roots in the sand. What made it worse was that this wasn't just any base, it was Fort Kestrel, a post known for its elite status and operational discipline. Failure, even in maintenance, wasn't something that went unnoticed. Sergeant Braden Knox, the lead technician on the tank detail, was respected and reliable, a no-nonsense kind of man who preferred doing over-theorizing. But as frustration mounted and solutions dwindled, even he started pacing. His team, all solid and competent, whispered theories back and forth like conspiracy theorists in a pressure cooker. It wasn't electrical, it wasn't fuel, it wasn't hydraulics. At one point, someone even joked that the tank was haunted. Normally, such a comment would have been met with eye rolls, but now it lingered in the air, not because they believed it, but because they were out of better explanations. By midday, word had reached Colonel Emery Reese, the base commander. A man of sharp angles and sharper expectations, Reese had seen deployments, negotiations, and disasters in every time zone on Earth. He was no stranger to chaos, but he demanded order inside his command. The tank issue, initially a minor inconvenience, had now become an embarrassment. A small crowd had begun to gather near the mechanics' bay, as other soldiers took interest. Even visiting cadets were starting to murmur about the, quote, cursed tank. Reese hated rumors more than malfunctioning hardware. It was in the middle of this rising tension that Reese made an unexpected call to a man few on base had ever heard of, someone not listed in active personnel nor part of the civilian contractor crew. His name was Walter Langley. Years ago, Langley had served as a senior combat systems engineer, known for his intuitive mechanical understanding and a knack for fixing things others had given up on. But he'd retired quietly, almost a decade earlier, after a particularly grueling tour overseas where an IED left him with a permanent limp and nerve damage in one hand. Since then, he'd disappeared into rural life in northern Arizona. Most assumed he spent his days fishing and staying off-grid. He was not the type of man you expected to get a call from a colonel. But he came. The next morning, a tan Ford pickup truck rolled slowly through the base gates. Out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 70s, with silver hair, a trimmed beard, and a face like weathered sandstone. His uniform was long replaced by jeans, a utility shirt, and boots worn smooth at the soles. He moved like a man who had learned to measure his steps, not because of pain, but because of precision. Slung over his shoulder was a green canvas tool bag with oil stains, older than some of the privates watching him. Langley didn't say much. He didn't salute. He just nodded once at Reese and then asked to see the tank. Braden Knox wasn't thrilled. He'd heard whispers about the man during his training years. Legends, mostly. Stories about Langley diagnosing a faulty sensor just by listening to the hum of a machine, or recalibrating a targeting system using only a pocket compass and a shoelace. But legends didn't fix tanks. Still, orders were orders. He stepped aside and let the old man in. Langley didn't touch the tank at first. He circled it slowly, hands behind his back, eyes scanning the hull and turret, as if he were reading a story no one else could see. He paused by the engine access panel, crouched without complaint, and listened. Not to the tank, because it made no sound, but to the silence around it. Then he stood, rolled up his sleeves, and opened his bag. He didn't ask for assistance. He didn't consult the manuals. He just got to work, quietly, calmly, like he'd done this 100 times before. The crowd had grown again. Even some of the higher-ups had trickled in, curious to see what this ghost from the past could possibly accomplish. And that's when it happened, without ceremony, without announcement. A low, throaty rumble broke the silence. The tank shuddered, growled, then roared to life. Not with a cough or sputter, but a clean ignition that sounded more confident than any of the failed attempts the day before. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, as if on cue, a burst of cheers erupted from the watching soldiers. Someone slapped Braden's shoulder. Others looked to Colonel Reese for his reaction. But the colonel was just watching Langley, who had already begun packing up his tools. No celebration, no smugness, just purpose. And that's where it all began. Not just the engine's ignition, but the deeper story that would unfold in the coming days. Because what Walter Langley reawakened that day wasn't just a machine. He stirred something deeper, something buried in every soldier who had ever doubted the worth of their past, the relevance of their experience, or the idea that sometimes the old ways still had something to teach. Walter Langley had never been much for the spotlight. Long before he became a whisper of legend among young cadets and a name that older officers invoked with quiet reverence, he was simply the man who showed up before dawn and stayed long after the sun dipped below the horizon. His hands were always smudged with grease, his thoughts occupied by torque ratios and pressure valves, and his quiet manner made him nearly invisible in a room full of noise. But to those who worked alongside him, Langley was the kind of man who could make silence speak volumes. He didn't raise his voice, didn't bark orders, and didn't need to. His presence alone carried the kind of authority that couldn't be faked, earned only through decades of showing up, solving problems, and never once asking for recognition. After retiring, Langley had retreated to a modest home in the northern reaches of Arizona, a wide-stretching land of pines, rocks, and solitude. He bought a little plot near a forgotten stream and built a cabin with his own 2 hands. It wasn't fancy. Nothing about him ever was, but it was sturdy, efficient, and functional. He had no family left. His wife, Mary Ann, had passed years earlier, and their only child had died in infancy. Walter never spoke of it, not to neighbors, not to old army friends, and certainly not to strangers. He just carried on, the grief tucked deep beneath layers of calm and focus. Each morning Langley brewed black coffee over a gas flame, sat on his porch, and listened to the wind rustling through the pines. Occasionally he'd take on repair work for nearby ranchers, an old tractor with a fuel timing issue, a water pump suffering from mineral buildup, a generator that wouldn't stay online. Word spread that he was dependable, underpriced, and uninterested in small talk. Folks came to him when they wanted things done right, not when they wanted to socialize. It had been nearly a decade since Langley stepped foot on a military base. He kept the memories folded up like an old flag in a drawer. His years of service, the complicated missions, the nights huddled beside machines that had to work because failure meant casualties. There had been a time when those years defined him. But time has a way of stripping titles away and sanding down the sharp corners of purpose. These days, he was just Walt from the woods, and he was fine with that. When the call came from Colonel Rise, it didn't come through official channels. Reese had reached out through an old personal contact, someone Langley had once mentored during a grueling overseas deployment in Kandahar. The message was simple, just a quiet request, no urgency in tone but a weight in the words that Langley recognized immediately. Reese didn't explain the problem in detail. He didn't need to. Langley understood the subtext. They were stuck, and no one else could unstick them. And for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, Langley didn't hesitate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Despite the distance and his age, Langley packed his tools that night. He pulled out the canvas bag he hadn't touched in years, inspected his wrenches, recalibrated his voltmeter, and refilled his flask with black coffee. When he arrived at Fort Kestrel, he looked out of place. Civilian clothes in a sea of uniforms, a weathered face among bright-eyed recruits, silence in a world of commands and status reports. But none of that mattered to him. He wasn't there to impress or reminisce. He came for the machine. He came because something in him stirred when he heard it wasn't working. And that old part of him, the part buried deep beneath years of isolation, hadn't forgotten what it felt like to be needed. What few people saw beneath Langley's rugged demeanor and mechanical mastery was a quiet humility forged not in success, but in failure. Years ago, he'd been responsible for a convoy repair that went wrong. A diagnostic oversight on a fuel routing system resulted in a transport vehicle losing power during a high-risk operation. It cost lives. Though the official report didn't place direct blame, Langley knew where the responsibility truly lay. That moment haunted him more than he let on. It was one of the reasons he left the service. Not in disgrace, but in self-imposed exile. He needed time to be somewhere that didn't remind him of what he couldn't undo. And yet, despite all of that, his skill remained unparalleled. Langley had the rare gift of seeing systems in layers, of hearing the whisper of friction where others only heard silence, of feeling mechanical imbalance through the soles of his boots. It wasn't magic, it was mastery, decades of repetition and instinct honed to surgical precision. That mastery, however, came wrapped in solitude. Langley never taught a class, never published manuals. He believed that the deeper truths of machines, and of people, couldn't be passed on through PowerPoint slides or training drills. They had to be experienced, earned, lived through. That belief often put him at odds with younger officers who wanted fast results, digital readouts, and clean checklists. But even they, when faced with a problem no system could solve, would find themselves asking, what would Langley do? He didn't want medals. He didn't want ceremonies. He wanted to work. To fix what was broken, to understand why it failed, and how to make it right. That was how he grieved, how he processed, how he stayed human in a world that often turned men like him into machines. So when Langley restarted that tank engine, it wasn't a miracle. It was the outcome of everything he had lived, suffered, built, and internalized. It was an act of precision, not flair. And while the soldiers cheered and the colonel nodded in approval, Langley's mind had already moved on. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared so deeply, he couldn't let himself linger. He knew what came next. Machines were easy, people were harder. And something in the way Reese looked at him that morning told Langley this was just the beginning, not of a job, but of something more meaningful, something that might finally connect the man he had been with the man he had become. Fort Kestrel sat on the edge of the Sonoran Desert like a scar pressed into the earth, its concrete structures sun-bleached and sun-beaten, nestled between stretches of endless sand and jagged, unforgiving ridgelines. From the air, the base looked like a neatly arranged grid of function over form, rows of barracks, motor pools, training yards, and admin buildings. But on the ground, it pulsed with constant motion. Dust coated every surface. Metal doors creaked under dry wind. Soldiers moved in routine patterns, a mixture of precise order and controlled chaos. The air constantly smelled of fuel, gunpowder residue, and scorched rubber, an olfactory cocktail that clung to uniforms and embedded itself in every fiber of life there. No matter the rank, no one was exempt from the desert's reach. The base wasn't designed to be comfortable, it was designed to be durable. Steel beams, corrugated roofs, modular trailers doubling as briefing rooms, and blast walls that defied elegance all made up the skeletal frame of Fort Kestrel. Air conditioning units rattled in protest under the weight of relentless heat. Even in the early morning, sweat gathered under collars and pooled beneath body armor. The sun didn't just rise, it attacked. By midday, the concrete pads were hot enough to warp tools left unattended. The desert didn't kill fast. It exhausted you slowly, dried you out, drained your edge, and made you careless. And that's why the base drilled discipline harder than any other post in the Southwest. Out here, a lapse in routine could mean real casualties. Langley took all of this in the way a seasoned engineer observes a power grid, quietly, without reaction, scanning for flaws and patterns. The base hadn't changed much since his last deployment a decade ago. New faces, certainly, a few upgraded systems, but the heartbeat of it remained. Soldiers moving with purpose, barked orders bouncing off cement walls, the distant crack of rifle training echoing like a metronome for duty. But beneath the surface, there was something else. A layer of stress that didn't come from heat or exhaustion alone. It was in the eyes of the junior mechanics, in the furrowed brows of officers crossing the yard, and in the way Colonel Reese stood with his hands clasped tightly behind his back, as though holding something inside that refused to be let out. The base's motor pool sprawled along the northern quadrant with rows of armored vehicles, some parked in neat lines, others half disassembled, waiting for diagnostics. Maintenance tents stretched over pits where engines were lowered and track systems replaced. The tank Langley had revived sat off to the side now, still idling softly, its metal hide shimmering in the heat. Around it, soldiers had resumed their routines, but with a new air of deference, not toward the machine, but toward the man who had made it breathe again. Langley noted the subtle nods, the respectful silence that followed him when he passed. It wasn't admiration they felt. It was something older, more primal, the awe of someone who had seen the impossible made real. Inside the command building, cool air hissed from overhead vents, a rare reprieve from the inferno outside. Hallways were narrow and practical, lined with tactical maps, personnel rosters and whiteboards scribbled with mission flowcharts and timelines. Reese's office overlooked the training yard, a vantage point from which the colonel could observe everything and everyone. The windows were tinted, but Langley knew from memory how much the man relied on sight. Reese didn't believe in relying solely on reports. He believed in watching how people moved, hesitated, or performed under stress. It was a habit formed in wartime, one that hadn't dulled in peacetime. The environment at Fort Kestrel wasn't just physical, it was cultural. There was a hierarchy more complex than rank. You had your lifers, the career military, who could field strip an M4 in their sleep and recited regulations like scripture. You had your specialists, brains behind the systems, glued to tablets and code diagnostics. Then the trainees, eyes wide and fingers still uncertain, stumbling through chain of command etiquette and hoping to make it to dinner without getting chewed out. And finally, the ghosts, men like Langley, who didn't officially belong but whose presence restructured the entire gravity of the place. Langley, for his part, hadn't expected to feel anything. He thought the base would feel like a relic, a sealed chapter. But as he walked past the machine shops and weapons lockers, as he heard cadences being called in the morning runs and smelled the distinct mixture of gun oil and burned toast wafting from the mess hall, something stirred. Not nostalgia, something heavier, a pull he didn't know he'd missed until it found him again. Everywhere he looked, he saw echoes. A young corporal tightening a hydraulic line the way Langley once did in Bosnia. A seasoned mechanic barking torque specs down the line. Same tone, same impatience Langley had used during a high-pressure mission in Ramadi. He saw old ghosts too, men who hadn't made it home, their faces somehow reflected in the eyes of a new generation. It was like time had folded in on itself. The base was different, but the story was the same. Youth doing their best under pressure. Officers trying to maintain control in a system that was always 2 inches from chaos. And machines, always machines, waiting for someone who understood not just how they worked, but why they failed. In the briefing room where Langley was eventually asked to return for further consultation, fluorescent lights buzzed, and a projector displayed a 3D schematic of the base's aging heavy artillery fleet. The room was filled with young officers, some curious, some skeptical, a few silently hostile to the idea that an old civilian could teach them anything. Langley didn't care. He wasn't there to impress them. He was there because the systems were breaking down in ways manuals couldn't explain. He'd seen it before. Not just mechanical fatigue, but procedural drift. Too much reliance on software, not enough on instinct. It wasn't the machines that were failing. It was the people interpreting the signals. Langley leaned back, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room the same way he scanned the desert. Everyone was waiting for his analysis. And though he would give it, eventually, he first needed to understand one thing. Not about the tanks or the base. About the people. He needed to know if anyone here still remembered how to listen, not just to him, but to the machines. Because buried inside the hum of a generator or the whine of a worn drive shaft was the truth. And unless someone was willing to really hear it, this base, like many others, was running on borrowed time. The problem wasn't the machines. Langley had seen enough tanks, APCs, and mobile artillery systems in his lifetime to know that when they failed, it was never without a reason. But the true conflict brewing at Fort Kestrel wasn't mechanical, it was human. And at the center of that human failure stood Captain Ryland Voss, a man whose ambition burned hotter than the desert sun, and whose confidence in his methods left no room for nuance, tradition, or inconvenient truths. Voss was the kind of officer who believed in control above all else. His uniforms were always pristine, his reports immaculate, and his reputation spotless among the upper brass. But beneath that polish lay a rigidity that clashed with the unpredictable nature of real-world operations. Voss had recently been promoted to lead the Tactical Engineering Division, overseeing everything from armored vehicle maintenance to combat tech readiness drills. Young, sharp-jawed, and unyieldingly by-the-book, he was known for running his team like a silicon chip. Precise, efficient, and devoid of sentiment. To many, he represented the future of military leadership. Tech-forward, results-driven, and immune to the messiness of gut instinct. But to Langley, he was the kind of man who misunderstood the very systems he was charged with managing. He could quote specifications down to the decimal, but he had never once held a fractured hydraulic pump and felt the grain of erosion caused by fine desert sand. He trusted data over experience and algorithms over intuition. Voss had been present during Langley's quiet triumph with the tank engine, but he hadn't clapped. He hadn't nodded in appreciation or thanked the man who solved what his best team couldn't. Instead, he'd folded his arms and watched with narrowed eyes, already framing the event in a narrative that preserved his command authority. The old man got lucky, Voss told himself. Anyone could have stumbled onto the solution if given enough time. Still, Langley's sudden relevance on base presented an uncomfortable disruption to Voss's carefully managed order. The colonel had not only brought the engineer back without running it through Voss's chain of command, but he'd also given Langley operational access to the motor pool for follow-up inspections. That stung. From Voss's perspective, Langley represented the past, obsolete, analog, and dangerously unaccountable. The Army was no longer a place for cowboy mechanics and mythologized problem solvers. It was a digital force now, with automated diagnostics, predictive maintenance tools, and standardized operating procedures. The idea that an old retiree with a canvas bag and no clearance could show up and outperform his crew wasn't just an embarrassment, it was a threat. And Voss didn't tolerate threats, especially not ones that made his spotless record look like a facade. Langley, for his part, didn't care much for Voss's opinion, but he recognized the danger. He'd seen men like Voss before, officers who mistook authority for wisdom and management for leadership. In the field, that mindset got people hurt. In peacetime, it bred a brittle kind of competence that looked strong on paper but collapsed under pressure. And Langley wasn't just here to restart one tank. Reese had quietly asked him to conduct an unofficial audit, an unspoken assessment of the base's mechanical health. That meant Langley needed access, trust, and time. Three things Voss now controlled tightly. Almost immediately, resistance began to take form. Langley's requests for older maintenance logs were delayed or returned with pages redacted under the guise of protocol. Junior technicians who had shown curiosity and openness around Langley were suddenly reassigned or given other duties. Equipment he needed was marked unavailable or under inspection. It wasn't sabotage, not exactly. It was obstruction masked in bureaucracy. A slow choke of access that forced Langley to work twice as hard, to learn half as much. But the most telling shift came during a scheduled systems calibration for a fleet of inactive APCs. Langley had identified a pattern, multiple diagnostics across different units showing irregular pressure variance in their fuel injection systems. It wasn't critical yet, but it was the kind of issue that, if left unattended, could cascade into full-blown failures. He compiled the findings in a report, written not in technical jargon but plain terms, and submitted it through the proper channels. Days passed with no response. When he followed up, the report was marked, reviewed, no action required. Langley knew that was Voss's handwriting in the margin. The message was clear. Voss didn't just want Langley gone. He wanted to erase the man's relevance entirely. By discrediting his insights, burying his concerns, and isolating him from the mechanics, Voss could regain control over the narrative. The tank had been a fluke. The rest was just an old man poking around where he didn't belong. Langley felt the walls closing in, but he didn't push back. Not immediately. He watched, listened, and took notes. He understood that systems didn't fail all at once. They failed in increments. One missed alarm, one overlooked pressure reading, one misjudged timeline, and right now, Fort Kestrel was showing all the signs of a slow unravel. The tank's failure wasn't the problem, it was the symptom. Meanwhile, Reese stood in a precarious position. Though he had faith in Langley, he also had to navigate the tightrope of command politics. Voss had powerful allies at Central Command and a spotless service record to bolster his claims. Ross couldn't afford open conflict within his leadership ranks, especially with a civilian consultant stirring unease. He needed Langley to be right, provably right, about something that couldn't be brushed off or rationalized away. He needed the kind of failure that Voss couldn't spin. And Langley, despite the mounting resistance, was quietly searching for it. Because beneath all the tension, this wasn't about one man's ego or another's redemption. It was about a culture that had begun to trade experience for optics, depth for speed, and wisdom for compliance. Langley wasn't just up against Voss. He was up against a system that believed it had evolved beyond the need for people like him, and if that system was wrong, people would pay the price. The fifth day after the tank's arrival dawned under a blanket of gray skies, and with it came a quiet but growing urgency across Fort Brooks. Colonel Patrick Haynes, who had maintained a patient and watchful stance until now, felt the creeping edge of concern prick at the corners of his calm exterior. The previous day's attempt by the engineering team had come and gone without any meaningful progress. The tank's engine, a beast of reinforced steel, stubborn silence, and mechanical complexity, sat unmoved in the hangar, as if mocking the best efforts of the men surrounding it. Word had begun to spread through unofficial channels that the newest delivery from Central Command, a next-generation Mark IX siege tank prototype, was somehow defective, cursed, or beyond repair. Hushed jokes floated in the mess halls, and whispers of frustration laced the conversations among junior officers. In a facility built on precision, discipline, and results, this unsolvable machine had become a weighty symbol of something deeper, something none dared say aloud but many had started to believe. Maybe they weren't good enough to handle what was coming next. Inside Hangar 3, the largest maintenance bay on the grounds, the tension hung thicker than engine oil. Lieutenant Mason was pacing again, his boots clapping against the concrete in rhythm, with the soft clinks of metal tools being laid down and picked up. He had barely slept the previous night. The team had tried everything, replaced the starter, recalibrated the electronic control unit, even reverted to old-school mechanical diagnostics that hadn't been used in over a decade. Nothing had worked. The manual gave them schematics, but the tank had custom modifications, experimental overlays, and coded systems that didn't fully match anything they had seen before. One technician even suggested the thing had been shipped with mismatched firmware, a frightening possibility that meant weeks, if not months, of bureaucracy and waiting. Mason had sent him out of the room before his words could demoralize the rest of the crew. The colonel entered quietly, but everyone noticed. The chatter died down, screwdrivers paused mid-turn, and eyes rose to meet his steady gaze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Just his presence had a way of drawing the room's attention into focus. He walked past the workbenches, the diagnostic tablets, the worn manuals spread open like holy texts, and finally approached the tank itself. It loomed large in the hangar like a sleeping dragon, armor plates glinting under the ceiling lights. The colonel stared at it, eyes sweeping over its treads, turret, and engine compartment. He didn't speak immediately, and that silence pressed heavily on everyone. When he finally turned around, he asked only one question. Has anyone considered someone who worked on the Mark 7 prototypes? The room remained still. No one answered, not because they hadn't thought of it, but because the question pointed towards something they all silently knew and avoided. Those kinds of engineers were long gone, retired, moved on, or worse, deceased. They had built the legacy models that had paved the way for the Mark 9, and with them had gone decades of field experience and practical insight that no manual could replicate. Mason opened his mouth, but the colonel was already moving again, walking briskly toward the doors. "I'll make a call," he said, voice quiet but resolute. "I think I know someone." A few hours later, as the clouds outside split to let streaks of afternoon light pour through, a dusty red pickup truck pulled up beside the hangar. The doors creaked open, and out stepped a man who looked like he had wrestled time and come out bruised but undefeated. His name was Walter Griggs, age 71, retired Master Sergeant and former Chief Field Engineer for the now-defunct Northern Armor Division. His once dark hair had faded to a smoky gray, and his gait was slower, measured by the knees that didn't quite bend like they used to. But his eyes, those storm-colored, piercing eyes, carried the same calculating sharpness that had once earned him the nickname Mechanic General. He hadn't been on a base in years, hadn't touched anything military besides a lawnmower or a tool shed door hinge since retirement. But when Colonel Haynes had called, Walter hadn't hesitated. Inside the hangar, whispers buzzed as Griggs walked past the stunned engineering team. No one knew him personally, but some had heard stories about how he used to fix tanks in sandstorms with limited tools, about the time he jury-rigged a fire suppression system from spare ammo canisters and kept a convoy from exploding. Mason tried to introduce himself, but Walter waved it off. He went straight to the tank, stood before it like a man greeting an old rival, and placed a calloused hand against its front panel. There was a long moment where he just stood there, touching the metal, breathing in its stillness. "Where's the access panel for the rear diagnostics?" he asked eventually. Mason pointed toward the side of the tank, and Walter nodded. "Bring me a portable rig, a thermal reader, and one of those tablets you've all been staring at like it's going to pray this beast into waking." The tone was dry, but not cruel. It was a voice of quiet command, born from experience, not rank. The younger engineers scrambled into motion, half in awe, half relieved that someone new was taking the lead. Walter spent the next 3 hours crawling in and out of the tank's innards, muttering to himself, checking readings, tapping the metal with a small hammer like a physician testing reflexes. He didn't explain everything he did, and no one dared interrupt. Mason watched from a distance, fascinated. The man didn't work fast, but he worked right. He traced one problem after another, not from manuals, but from instinct, memory, and something deeper, a sort of mechanical intuition honed by decades in the field. At one point, Walter paused, squinted at a panel of wires behind the main coupling, and chuckled softly. "You see, that's your problem right there. They rerouted the coolant failsafe, but didn't account for field starting behavior. This thing's trying to auto-protect before it even spins the starter." He didn't even look up. "Bet you've been chasing voltage when it's been a safety loop lockout the whole time." Mason blinked. "That wasn't in any manual." Walter looked at him and grinned. "They don't teach this in tech school. You only learn it when you've watched one of these things sputter in the middle of a monsoon." As evening settled and the lights inside the hangar flickered to full brightness, Walter finally straightened up, dusted off his hands, and motioned for them to try it. The mechanics hesitated, unsure, until the colonel nodded. The key turned, the engine groaned, and then, to everyone's astonishment, the Mark 9 roared to life, with a growl so deep it rattled the overhead beams. The mechanics erupted in cheers, Mason stared in disbelief, and the colonel simply smiled. But Walter? Walter just looked at the tank like an old friend, finally waking up after a long sleep. "Told you she wasn't dead," he muttered, then walked out of the hangar without waiting for applause. They waited, breath held in collective anticipation, as the retired engineer knelt beside the silent metal beast like a priest at a forgotten altar. Warren Monroe's presence had shifted the air itself. Gone was the nervous fumbling, the defeatist shrugs, the helpless loops of trial and error the younger mechanics had fallen into. Here stood a man who didn't second-guess, who didn't argue with a machine but listened to it like an old friend. He didn't even start with the engine itself. Instead, he walked around the tank slowly, his eyes scanning every inch of its worn and dented surface, noting the faint soot on the exhaust pipe, the scuffed edges near the rear axle, the subtle misalignment of the tracks. He didn't speak for a long time, and no one dared to interrupt. It wasn't until he asked for a spanner that people remembered they were still standing around watching. Monroe worked differently than any of them had seen. He didn't tear things apart. He touched them like they were alive. He unlatched the upper maintenance hatch and ran his hand across the housing bolts, murmuring under his breath, not prayers or curses but numbers, torque values, pressure thresholds, timelines. He was calculating something invisible to everyone else. Then he asked for a flashlight. The colonel had one in his pocket and handed it over. Monroe leaned in, shining the light into the gearbox assembly, whistling as he inspected the chains. "She's not broken," he finally said. "She's tired." The men looked at each other. "What did that even mean?" Monroe elaborated. The tank's systems had been overworked without adequate recalibration. The diesel intake valve was slightly warped, not enough to show in normal diagnostics, but enough to starve the engine under load. The electrical starter had inconsistent grounding due to corrosion near the battery terminal. Corrosion missed because the clamps had been polished only on the visible side. And worse, the cooling system had developed a subtle vapor lock. It was a cascade of micro-issues, none fatal on their own, but in unison, enough to silence the war machine completely. Monroe explained it not like a lecturer, but like a storyteller. Each component's history had a voice in his mind. Each failure was a phrase in the tank's language. He told them the tank hadn't failed them. It had been calling for help in ways no one recognized. Then he asked for silence. He sat on the edge of the tank's frame and closed his eyes. It was like he was rewinding a reel in his mind, playing back the hums, the clicks, the engine grunts from a week ago when the tank first began to act up. He could hear the sputters that no one had recorded, feel the heat through memory that the gauges hadn't captured. After half an hour of recalibration, replacement of a bypass hose, cleaning out of a crusted-over filter, and a subtle but essential reorientation of a compression valve, Monroe stood up. He wiped his hands with a rag and said, "She's ready to try." Everyone gathered again, this time in total silence. No wisecracks, no predictions, only reverence. The starter was engaged. For a second, nothing. Then a low cough, followed by a deep growl from within. The machine rumbled like a waking dragon, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence, the pistons finding rhythm, the drivetrain sinking into motion. The engine roared to life, a cheer erupted, involuntary, explosive. Even the colonel allowed himself a rare smile. The tank wasn't just functional, it was reborn. Monroe didn't celebrate. He stepped back, his hands folded, simply nodding. To him, this wasn't victory, it was reunion. After the tank was confirmed operational, with a successful test run around the compound, Monroe was invited into the barracks for coffee and debriefing, but he declined. He stood outside, looking at the horizon, arms crossed, his eyes distant. Colonel Abrams joined him, silent at first. Monroe finally spoke. "You know, when I first built her, she was meant for different times. Times when we believed in the permanence of machines. Funny how fragile permanence can be." The colonel said nothing, only nodded. They stood together in that heavy moment, knowing that while war machines age and rust, the men who understood their souls were even rarer, and even more fragile. Monroe's presence lingered like an echo. The mechanics were energized in the following days, approaching their work with fresh eyes, applying the lessons they had learned through observation and quiet awe. The colonel began to consider bringing in more veterans, not just for ceremonial honors, but for their living knowledge. And somewhere beneath all the technical triumphs, the base felt different, more human, less transactional. Monroe had reminded them that machines were not just tools. They were histories, and when history breaks down, you don't replace it, you restore it. As Monroe prepared to leave, packing his few tools and well-worn gloves, he stopped and looked back at the tank one last time. It was parked now, quiet, but the sunlight glinted off its armored surface like it was smiling back at him. He tapped the hood gently, whispering something no one else heard. Then he walked away, not back into retirement, not exactly, but back into the stillness from which legends are sometimes called, only when absolutely necessary. Everything began to shift the moment the colonel, standing in the glaring sunlight beside the motionless tank, clutched his radio with a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. He had just finished speaking to someone none of the soldiers expected, someone whose name carried an air of mystery even to the most seasoned among them. The mechanics had given up. Their tools lay scattered across the hard ground like symbols of defeat. The engineering officers had exhausted the manuals, tried every bypass, and even pulled the schematics apart line by line. Yet the massive engine, with all its quiet promise of destructive power, sat stubbornly silent. It was an odd scene. An entire battalion idled, paralyzed, not by enemy fire or terrain, but by silence. A tank that wouldn't roar to life when the time had come. The colonel, Colonel Ransom, was a man not easily moved. His square jaw and deep-set eyes were the kind you'd find etched in bronze statues. He didn't speak much unless there was something worth saying, and when he did, people listened. That morning, however, his silence had grown heavier with every passing hour. He had personally called in the last resort. And when the retired engineer arrived, the turning point came not with fanfare, but with the simple sound of a pickup truck's tires crunching over gravel. No uniform, no salutes, just a man with a salt and pepper beard, thick glasses, and a calm that unnerved the younger officers. His name was Horace Langley. At first glance, Horace didn't command attention. He was slow in his step, walked with a slight limp, and wore an old army jacket that had seen too many winters. But Colonel Ransom didn't care how Horace looked. What mattered was what Horace knew. Decades ago, Horace had helped develop the first generation of high-efficiency combustion synchronization systems for armored vehicles, technology ahead of its time, full of tiny nuances that never made it into the field manuals. The colonel had remembered him not just because of a name in a dusty file, but because Horace had once been the man to resurrect a stalled convoy in a snowstorm with nothing but baling wire and his knowledge of fluid dynamics. Now Horace stood beside the tank, brushing his fingers over the cool steel like it was an old friend. The crew watched silently as he walked the perimeter, inspecting the maintenance log the mechanics had left behind, and listening, not to the tank, but to the mechanics as they described every futile step they'd taken. He never interrupted. He never corrected. He simply absorbed it all, nodding occasionally, as if translating their modern terminology into a language only he understood. Then came the moment when everything changed. Horace leaned in toward the open hatch, reached for a junction box the others had overlooked because it was technically irrelevant to the ignition system, and gently tapped it with the handle of a screwdriver. Nothing happened, at least, not outwardly. But Horace smiled. That small expression, almost imperceptible to most, was the turning point. It wasn't arrogance, it was recognition, like a musician hearing a familiar tune hidden beneath discordant notes. He didn't announce a solution. He simply climbed atop the tank with surprising agility, lifted a panel that hadn't been touched in days, and began adjusting a relay assembly by hand. It was a maneuver none of the onlookers understood. When the lead mechanic asked what he was doing, Horace responded with only 4 words. "It's listening too slow." The phrase confused everyone, except Colonel Ransom, whose eyes lit up. Horace explained, more to himself than anyone else, that the engine's signal interpreter was outdated. It had been trying to receive a sequence of commands too fast for its design, due to a software update that hadn't accounted for legacy component integration. In other words, the tank wasn't broken, it was overwhelmed, and Horace, with his hands and his knowledge, was going to teach it how to breathe again. Over the next 2 hours, Horace became a quiet force of transformation. He didn't use new tools, just his old ones, worn smooth with time. He rewired the junction to slow the pulse rate of the command relay, adjusted the feedback loop, and manually recalibrated the ignition delay. To an outsider, it looked like a man tinkering with old parts. But to those who understood, it was an act of resurrection. By the time the last bolt was tightened, a hush had fallen over the crowd. Even the birds had gone silent. Horace climbed down, wiped his hands, and nodded to the colonel. Colonel Ransom turned to the lead gunner, motioning him toward the ignition. The soldier climbed in, fingers trembling. One turn of the key. A low growl. Then a roar that shook the earth. The engine had awakened, not sputtering, not hesitating, fully alive. The air burst with cheers, but Horace didn't bask in it. He simply stepped back, hands in his pockets, and watched the machine come to life like a phoenix emerging from ash. In that moment, the battalion witnessed not just the revival of a tank, but the power of knowledge that hadn't been forgotten, only retired. The turning point wasn't mechanical, it was human. A man who had lived quietly on the edge of memory had stepped back into the light, and in doing so reminded everyone that progress isn't always found in what's new, but sometimes in what's quietly waiting to be remembered. The next morning arrived, cloaked in fog and uncertainty, a muted sun barely piercing through the thick mist that had settled over Fort Brambleton like a damp wool blanket. Mechanics moved like ghosts between rows of dormant tanks, their breath visible in the cold morning air, their expressions tinged with a mix of fatigue and silent frustration. The T-109A, the beast that refused to roar, remained as lifeless as ever, its hatches sealed shut like the lips of a stubborn veteran guarding a secret. Colonel Beckett stood on the observation deck overlooking the field, sipping his black coffee, his mind already racing through scenarios. Today was supposed to be the final full systems test before the regional war games began, and failure meant public embarrassment, a delayed timetable, and potentially a reprimand from Central Command. And yet, with all the tools, brains, and brute strength at their disposal, they hadn't cracked the mystery. That's when he saw the green pickup truck rumbling through the gate, a stark contrast to the modern military vehicles flanking the motor pool. Dust swirled in its wake as it rolled down the gravel road, passing saluting guards who raised their eyebrows at the sight. Inside was Leonard Braddock, slouched behind the wheel, wearing a faded army jacket from another era and a flat cap pulled low over his silver hair. Riding shotgun was Corporal Harris, chewing nervously on gum as if he had something to prove by escorting a legend. Braddock stepped out slowly when they arrived, taking in the scene with the kind of eyes that had seen decades of conflict and machinery. His steps weren't swift, but each one seemed deliberate, as if measuring the soil beneath him. Mechanics watched in a quiet hush as the man made his way toward the tank, some unaware of who he was, others whispering tales they'd only heard in mess halls about the Gear Whisperer of Kandahar, a nickname passed down by engineers who'd served with him in the desert theaters of the late 90s. Colonel Beckett met him halfway, and without pleasantries or ceremony simply nodded and gestured toward the inert steel mammoth. Braddock tilted his head, squinting at the T-109A like a doctor sizing up a stubborn patient who refused to cooperate. He walked a slow circle around it, brushing his fingers along the hull as though greeting an old friend. At one point he paused, crouched, and placed his ear against a panel near the engine intake. The mechanics exchanged glances. Some scoffed silently. What could an old man with no diagnostics gear possibly hear through 2 inches of composite armor? But Braddock wasn't performing. He was listening. Then he stepped back and asked a simple question. When it did run, what did it sound like? The crew chief fumbled with the answer, citing terms from the maintenance logs, but Braddock waved it off. He wasn't interested in the logs. He wanted to know the texture of the sound, the nuance, the difference between a purr, a cough, and a growl. One mechanic finally said it had sounded like it was holding back, like it wanted to fire up, but couldn't exhale. Braddock nodded thoughtfully and asked for tools, not electronic ones, but analog, wrenches, a stethoscope, and a pressure gauge older than most of the soldiers on the base. He requested the manual shutoff valve blueprint and disappeared under the tank with only a flashlight and a roll of cloth with his favorite tools. The team watched, half skeptical, half in awe, as this relic from another era began methodically opening panels they'd already checked a dozen times. But Braddock wasn't moving like someone who looked for answers. He moved like someone who knew the question was wrong. Time passed slowly. Lunch came and went. Braddock didn't eat, didn't even speak. He lay half inside the engine bay, hands covered in grease, murmuring to himself. The fog began to lift in the afternoon, sunlight cutting golden streaks across the hull of the T-109A. At around 1,500 hours, he emerged, sweating and smiling faintly. He called for a battery check, not the standard procedure the team had run 20 times, but a diagnostic under full ambient load, measured manually. They humored him, and that's when the anomaly showed. The power was fine in isolation, but under stress, when simulating real engine load, the circuit controlling fuel injection lagged by less than 0.2 milliseconds, enough to confuse the onboard computer, enough to create a loop where the system prepped ignition but didn't allow it to complete. The engine wanted to start, it just wasn't being allowed to finish the sequence. Braddock grinned as he tapped the schematic with a grease-streaked finger. She's got a hesitation tick. Someone wrote a clever override that no longer plays well with new firmware. It wasn't the mechanic's fault. The software had been updated last month to version 6.2.1, but it was written with assumptions about sensor timing that didn't take into account Braddock's original hardware design tweaks back in 2003. And that tiny disconnect, the difference between theory and reality, was enough to silence a 70-ton war machine. Colonel Beckett looked at him with a mixture of amazement and something bordering on reverence. Braddock didn't gloat. He simply asked them to roll the tank onto the diagnostics line once more, this time with a bypass installed the old-fashioned way. A manually spliced analog relay with just enough delay calibration to match the older loop. As the system powered on, everyone held their breath. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared like a caged lion awakened from slumber. Soldiers cheered. The mechanics stared at each other, wide-eyed. One even laughed aloud in disbelief. The T-109A was alive. Not just running, but rumbling, with purpose, with heart. And the man who made it happen stood quietly beside it, brushing dirt off his hands, his eyes gleaming not with pride, but with a kind of contentment that only comes from solving a puzzle others deemed unsolvable. For Braddock, it wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about honoring the past, respecting the craft, and reminding everyone that sometimes wisdom doesn't come from manuals, but from memory. The day that followed began with a strange stillness across the motor pool, as if the very air held its breath. The early sun cut through the low fog in golden shafts, casting long shadows over the muddy ground and the row of silent tanks. The tension was visible on the faces of every crewman. They had seen the colonel return, but what caught everyone's attention wasn't his stern walk or commanding voice. It was the elderly man who walked a few steps behind him. Eli Brenner didn't wear a uniform, but he carried himself like someone who had once worn it with distinction. His gait was slow but deliberate, and his eyes scanned the row of machines with the kind of attention only someone who knew them deeply would give. The younger mechanics stood in confused silence, whispering among themselves. Some were visibly skeptical. They had thrown every modern diagnostic, every software patch, and every manual procedure at Tank 14, and none had worked. And now they were expected to place their hopes in an old man with grease-stained overalls and crow's feet around his eyes? Eli didn't respond to the murmurs. He simply walked toward the disabled tank like it was an old friend, as though reuniting after a long absence. The other tanks seemed to pale in comparison to Tank 14, and Eli approached it with reverence. He stopped a few feet away, took a deep breath, and pressed his palm against the metal plating. The cold steel met his skin like a handshake, firm, familiar, and unyielding. Colonel Harwood stood behind him, watching, saying nothing, giving the man the space he needed. Eli circled the vehicle slowly, not with the clinical disinterest of a technician, but with the focused presence of someone looking for a story. He crouched to examine the undercarriage, tapped near the treads with his knuckles, listened for tone and vibration, and paused occasionally to smell the air near exhaust vents. Then, without a word, he climbed up the side, opened the hatch, and disappeared inside. For several long minutes, there was only the occasional clang of tools, the shuffling of feet within the metal body, and the soft hum of memories long buried. The mechanics watched, unsure of whether they were witnessing brilliance or a stubborn old man chasing ghosts. But then, something changed. Eli reemerged with grease on his hands and a faint smile on his face. He called for a wrench, not a diagnostic tablet, not a laptop, but a simple hand wrench. One of the crew hesitated before jogging over and handing it to him. With a nod of thanks, Eli climbed back inside. Minutes later, a low, rhythmic knocking echoed from within the tank. It wasn't the grinding or clunking they'd heard before. It was purposeful, like tuning an instrument before a performance. Colonel Harwood stepped forward, closer to the tank. The crew held their breath. Eli's voice echoed faintly from inside, muffled but clear. "Clear the area." No one questioned him. They stepped back. The colonel gave a subtle nod of approval. And then it happened. With a single flick of the ignition and a deep, echoing churn, Tank 14 groaned like a beast roused from hibernation. The engine coughed, sputtered, then surged to life with a deep, throaty roar. The ground trembled. Exhaust hissed from the vents in clouds of black and gray. The vibrations could be felt in the chest, the way thunder resonates before a storm. For a moment, no one moved. The crew stared in disbelief. The machine that had defied their best efforts for weeks now stood alive and humming, its systems pulsing with energy, as if mocking them for ever doubting it. Eli emerged from the hatch, calm and composed. He wiped his hands with a cloth, glanced at the colonel, and offered a quiet nod. The colonel nodded back. No words were needed. The mechanics, still frozen in place, finally erupted into applause. It wasn't the kind of raucous cheer reserved for victories. It was the sound of humbled men witnessing a master at work. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others grinned like children seeing magic for the first time. Eli didn't bask in the applause. He walked down from the tank as though he'd just done something as routine as tying his shoes. One of the younger crew members, barely in his 20s, approached with a look of awe and asked what had been wrong. Eli looked at him, eyes kind but firm, and said, "It wasn't the tank that needed fixing. It was how you were listening to it." The words settled over them like scripture. For all their reliance on data, they had forgotten the language of the machine. They had overlooked the rhythm, the feel, the voice of the steel. Eli hadn't diagnosed the tank, he had listened to it, and it had told him exactly what it needed. That night, the motor pool was alive with a different kind of energy. Mechanics talked late into the evening, not just about the fix, but about how they had underestimated the old ways. They looked through manuals again, not just the digital PDFs, but the dog-eared paper copies buried under dust. They practiced tightening bolts by feel, listened to engines with their ears, instead of relying only on graphs. And in the center of it all, Tank 14 sat like a monument, not just to mechanical ingenuity, but to the timeless value of wisdom, patience, and humility. The morning came heavy with anticipation. A fine mist floated above the field, clinging to the husks of metal and canvas, as if nature herself were watching, holding her breath. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Rowan stood with his arms behind his back, his uniform perfectly pressed but his eyes dark from a sleepless night. Across from him, the hangar doors creaked open with the slow groan of old hinges, revealing the hulk of the dormant tank they had struggled so long to awaken. The new cables had been laid, the fresh oil was pumped, the igniter switch had been recalibrated twice, and all diagnostic lights now glowed green. There was no logical reason the tank shouldn't start, unless logic had nothing to do with it. Miles away in a humble garage, tucked between rolling hills and weeping pine trees, Harold Brenner was already up, sipping black coffee from a battered thermos, his calloused hands cradling the warmth, while his eyes stared far beyond the morning newsprint. It had been a week since he'd been in that base. 7 days of silence from Rowan, and 7 days of Harold pretending he wasn't checking his phone every hour. Though his bones ached and the stiffness in his right hand had grown worse, it wasn't physical discomfort that gnawed at him. It was the sense of unfinished duty. He had felt it before, years ago when he'd been shipped out of Kandahar while his platoon remained behind to complete their final assignment. That same itch was back, and no amount of wrenching engines or sanding rusted farm tools could scratch it. At exactly 09:00, a knock came at his door, sharp, efficient, military. Harold opened it to find not a young corporal, not a messenger, but Rowan himself. Dressed in his field gear, he looked different somehow, more urgent but also more respectful. He extended a tablet toward Harold with a short video clip queued up. The engine. It sputtered, choked, then died. Again. The lights dimmed. The instruments failed. Rowan didn't say a word, but his expression asked the question for him. Harold set the coffee down without a word, walked to the coat rack, pulled on his canvas jacket, and followed the colonel to the jeep. There were no handshakes, no need. Respect had already been forged through challenge and disappointment. The ride back was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of tires on tarmac. But Harold's mind was anything but still. He replayed the layout of the tank over and over, the wiring he hadn't inspected, the vent system he had barely checked, the cooling module that hadn't hissed the way it was supposed to. Hambada. He suspected what the problem might be, but confirming it meant crawling deep into the belly of the beast. When they arrived, the entire base seemed to pause. Soldiers saluted but didn't speak. Technicians stood in rows along the path to the hangar. The news had spread. The old man was back. Whether they expected a miracle or a last-ditch effort was unclear, but Harold felt the weight of every gaze. Inside, the tank loomed like a silent sentinel. Its surface gleamed with new bolts and cleaned panels, but it had the cold look of something untouched by life. Harold walked around it once without speaking. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod to himself, he climbed atop the tank, popped the top hatch, and disappeared inside. Hours passed. Tools clinked. Echoes rang out. Occasionally his muffled voice would bark out requests. 2mm hex, mirror scope, flush light. No one dared interrupt. Colonel Rowan stood vigil by the hatch, arms crossed, lips thin. Afternoon rolled into evening. The mist of morning had burned off and been replaced by a dull, stifling heat. Still, the tank remained closed. Then, as the sun dipped low, casting long orange shadows across the field, a metallic clang rang out, a hatch lifting. Harold emerged, sweaty, grease-smeared, and with a wild glint in his eyes. He didn't ask for permission. He climbed down, grabbed the ignition keys from the technician's bench, and tossed them up to Rowan. "You turn it," Harold said. Rowan hesitated only a second before climbing atop the tank. Every breath seemed to stop. A long pause stretched before the key slid into the slot. Rowan gave it a firm turn. The dashboard flickered. Lights lit up one by one. The compressor began to hiss. Then, finally, a low, guttural rumble swelled into a full-bodied growl. The engine had come alive. Cheers erupted around the hangar. Mechanics embraced. Young soldiers who had once doubted the old man now clapped and whooped like kids at a county fair. Rowan didn't smile much, but even he couldn't suppress the flicker of pride in his eyes as he looked down at Harold, who simply folded his arms and muttered, "Told you it wasn't just parts." What Harold hadn't told them, what he suspected all along, was that a single sensor buried deep beneath the rear access panel had been installed backward. It hadn't been a design flaw or a catastrophic malfunction. It had been human error, one easily missed without tactile familiarity of that specific tank model. Something only someone who had once rebuilt it, bolt by bolt during the siege in Fallujah, would know. That night, Rowan offered Harold a ride home, but the old man declined. Instead, he stayed in the barracks, sitting outside with a tin of chewing tobacco and the sound of a living engine echoing through the night. Rowan later recorded in his logbook, "We brought in Harold Brenner to fix an engine. What he gave us back was belief, not just in machines, but in the quiet power of lived experience." But for Harold, it was simpler. As he sat under the stars, listening to the hum of the tank, now ready to serve again, he didn't think of medals or recognition. He thought of all the young engineers now watching closely, who would remember this moment not as the day the tank roared, but the day the past returned to light the path forward. The morning after the breakthrough, the mood across Fort Denton shifted like a veil being lifted. Where once there had been frustration and hushed murmurs of defeat, now there was energy in the air, pure, focused, and determined. Colonel Whitaker stood at the edge of the testing field, his boots rooted firmly in the gravel as the dew from the night still clung to the grass surrounding the tank bay. He watched his crew, men who had seemed exhausted and disheartened just days earlier, now bustling with purposeful motion. Clipboard in hand, Lieutenant Ramos checked and double-checked the checklist for the ignition sequence, while Lance Corporal Sims adjusted fuel pressure levels with a technician's precision. It was clear now that the team was unified under a single goal, proving that the retired engineer, Eugene Maddox, had not only solved the mechanical mystery but reignited a forgotten fire within them. Maddox himself remained relatively quiet that morning. He'd returned, just after sunrise, cup of black coffee in one hand, toolbox in the other, his eyes already scanning the control relays of the tank as if he'd never left. The night before, after he'd made the bold suggestion to adjust the starter coupling unit using a unique configuration he'd employed in the older Cold War-era models, something had clicked, not just mechanically, but philosophically. The tank wasn't just a failed prototype now. It was a symbol of stubborn resilience, of legacy, and of what happened when experience met innovation. The core issue, it turned out, was deceptively simple. The latest engine's ECU had not been calibrated to handle the torque variance caused by the new turbine fan assembly. The misalignment wasn't something most engineers would spot unless they had years of experience, hearing engines speak in whispers rather than roars. Eugene had not only heard it, he'd understood it like an old language. He proposed a modified ignition buffer sequence and a fine-tuning of the primary rotational synchronizer, a move that baffled the younger engineers at first, but which, after his hands made the adjustments in real time, began to show promise. Now all that remained was the moment of truth. Standing beside the tank's open side panel, Maddox tapped the relay housing gently, then gave a subtle nod to Ramos. Ramos turned to the main console, took a deep breath and began the startup procedure. The tank hissed. A low rumble echoed through the chassis like a sleeping beast awakening. The mechanics collectively froze, many holding their breath as the lights on the dashboard flickered from red to yellow to green. Then came the sound, a deep, rhythmic chug that built steadily, confidently, until it roared into a powerful, steady hum. The engine had come to life. Maddox stepped back slightly, his face calm, but his eyes reflecting a storm of emotions, relief, pride, and perhaps a flicker of vindication. For a moment, no one moved. Then cheers erupted from the team. Men clapped each other on the back, others simply stared at the tank in awe, and a few even let out tears they didn't bother hiding. Colonel Whitaker didn't speak. Instead, he walked slowly toward Maddox and extended his hand. The gesture was simple, but the meaning behind it was immense. Maddox accepted it with a firm shake, his grip steady, his expression still that of a man more concerned with whether the cooling fan would hold its RPM than with accolades. Over the next several hours, the team ran diagnostics, testing the engine under various stress loads. Everything performed flawlessly. Where once there had been mysterious shutdowns and inexplicable failures, there was now consistency, power, and predictability. Whitaker called for a short debrief in the strategy room later that afternoon. Everyone gathered: mechanics, engineers, officers, and support staff. At the center stood Maddox, who had to be coaxed into addressing the group. When he finally did, his speech was short, but it landed like a thunderclap. He didn't speak of heroism or brilliance. He talked about listening, not just to machines, but to people, to experience, to the stories the past can teach the present. He emphasized the importance of intergenerational respect, of remembering that sometimes progress wasn't about faster processors or more advanced code, but about human intuition forged through decades of trial, error, and grit. Ramos later remarked that it was the most profound debrief he'd ever attended. Whitaker, meanwhile, had already made a decision. He arranged for Maddox to be formally reinstated as a technical advisor for the engineering division. An honorary title, yes, but one that granted him full access to the base's systems and prototype projects. Maddox initially resisted, claiming he'd rather spend his remaining years restoring vintage bikes at his barn, but eventually he agreed under one condition: that the young engineers be allowed to shadow him one weekend a month, off base, where they could learn the old-fashioned way. By the time the sun dipped low and cast a golden hue across Fort Denton, it was clear that something more than just a tank engine had been reignited. Morale soared. Reports of the repair's success spread to other bases. The Department of Defense requested a formal review of Maddox's process, and several units even began requesting his insight on unrelated issues. But more importantly, a culture of deeper listening had begun to bloom. The once dismissed warhorse of a man had shown them that progress wasn't just about charging forward. Sometimes it meant taking a few steps back and listening to the echoes of those who'd walked the path before. That day, Eugene Maddox didn't just fix an engine. He restored a sense of purpose, and in doing so became the unlikely cornerstone of a quiet revolution inside the military's most advanced engineering corps. The morning air settled over Fort Wycombe like a heavy blanket, pressing against every man and machine alike as the sun began to rise. The towering silhouette of the disabled Viper tank loomed on the test field, silent and still, surrounded by clusters of engineers and officers who had run out of explanations. A low fog had crept in during the night, making the metallic sheen of the tank glimmer in the hazy light. Despite a full night's work, nothing had changed. The engine still refused to roar to life. Mechanics sat on toolboxes with defeated expressions, their eyes hollow from fatigue. Near the edge of the field, Major Whitmore stood stiffly, arms crossed, and beside him, Colonel Alistair Rhodes scanned the horizon with his jaw tight, waiting for a figure to emerge. And then he did. Lionel Harridge walked slowly but steadily across the gravel, his hands tucked into the pockets of his worn olive-drab coat, his presence immediately drawing all eyes toward him. He looked every bit the retired veteran he was, creased face, silver hair under a faded cap, and boots that had seen every kind of terrain, but there was a steadiness to his gait that exuded something rare in this moment, calm assurance. Colonel Rhodes stepped forward and nodded. Without a word, Lionel nodded back, as though they had already spoken everything necessary over the phone. The colonel motioned toward the tank, and Lionel's eyes followed. His face didn't betray surprise or worry. If anything, there was something almost reverent in his gaze as he looked at the Viper, a familiarity that no one else could quite place. He approached slowly, circling the tank once, running his fingers across the armor, the access panels, the intake vents. The younger engineers watched him silently, unsure whether to be skeptical or hopeful. He didn't speak yet. Instead, he asked for a ladder, climbed up to the turret, and inspected the panel housing the command interface. Inside the crew hatch, he leaned in and examined the wiring harnesses, pausing on a specific set of conduits and junctions others had apparently overlooked. When he emerged, he finally spoke, his voice gravelly but firm. He asked for a diagnostic terminal, but not the one they'd been using. He wanted the legacy port interface that connected directly with the core firmware of the Viper's CPU, a bypass system built into the tank for emergency maintenance. The crowd blinked. Some of the newer techs didn't even know that port existed, but Lionel insisted it was there, hidden under a fold-down panel beneath the driver's seat. One of the mechanics scrambled into the cabin and confirmed it. Lionel then connected the terminal and began inputting commands. Colonel Rhodes stood beside him, watching. He asked softly what he suspected. Lionel confirmed it. The problem wasn't mechanical. The engine, fuel systems, and turbines were functional. The issue was in the fail-safe override system, a fail-safe protocol designed decades ago to lock the ignition sequence if certain sensors detected micro-vibrations resembling sabotage. A good idea in theory, Lionel admitted, but the sensitivity on this particular model was calibrated improperly. He suspected the tank had absorbed residual harmonic tremors during transport, perhaps from an unstable carrier track, which tricked the system into a permanent lockdown mode. No one else had seen it because the alert signal didn't transmit through standard diagnostics. It was buried, only detectable through the legacy port. Colonel Rhodes stared at Lionel in astonishment. How had he known that? Lionel just gave a small shrug. Because he was the one who designed the override system in the first place. There was a stunned silence as this revelation sank in. Of course, it wasn't just that he had worked on tanks. He had helped build the Viper line, had authored sections of the engineering manual. What to others was a machine, to him was a creation he had once nurtured from blueprint to battlefield. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was a father to this beast. Working swiftly, Lionel reconfigured the sensitivity threshold, removed the locked loop, and reset the startup protocol. He gave the nod. One of the officers stepped forward and turned the key. For a moment, silence. And then, like a sleeping giant stirred from slumber, the Viper roared to life. The sound rolled across the field, deep and thunderous, sending vibrations through the boots of every onlooker. The exhaust vents spat mist and steam. Lights flickered on inside the console. It was alive again. A cheer rose, not loud or boisterous, but respectful, the kind of cheer that came from deep admiration. Lionel didn't bask in it. He just stepped back and watched the machine hum steadily, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. The mechanics and engineers approached him, not with awe, but with curiosity and gratitude. Some asked about the override system. Others asked if he'd be willing to teach. Lionel nodded. Of course, that was why he had come, not just to fix, but to pass down what had nearly been forgotten. As the sun climbed higher, Colonel Rhodes put a hand on Lionel's shoulder and said the words no one else could have delivered more sincerely. You saved us $1 million and 1,000 headaches. But more than that, you reminded us why experience matters. Lionel looked around at the eager young faces now listening to his explanations, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest. Not pride, not nostalgia, but purpose. He wasn't done. Not yet. There was still knowledge to give, still machines to teach, still futures to shape. And here, in the heart of Fort Wickham, beside the thunderous echo of a revived tank engine, Lionel Harridge stepped fully back into the world he thought had left him behind. As the hours passed into a soft mid-afternoon, a fragile calm returned to the workshop yard, broken only by the occasional metallic clink of tools being repositioned or a low murmur between the remaining mechanics. But there was a different energy in the air now, something that hadn't existed before Jeremiah Klein arrived. It wasn't bravado or desperation anymore, but a quiet anticipation. Some of the younger soldiers hung around on their breaks, pretending to check equipment or reposition crates just to be near the scene, unwilling to miss whatever would come next. Others, like Sergeant Tolman, stood in the shade by the fuel drums, arms crossed, eyes darting between Jeremiah and the massive tank, as if he were watching history decide whether it wanted to be rewritten. Meanwhile, Colonel Abrams hadn't said much since the schematics were spread out on the work table, but his presence was unmistakable, a silent observer with a mind moving faster than anyone could guess. Jeremiah remained hunched over the engine compartment, his eyes flicking back and forth across the wiring and old solder lines, as if reading a book only he could understand. The notes he had made on the old maintenance log were filled with fine, sharp annotations that made the writing of the previous engineers look almost like a child's first attempt. What was impressive wasn't that Jeremiah had theories, it was the confidence with which he was eliminating problems, each one not with guesswork, but with certainty rooted in hard-won experience. When he finally rose from the tank again, his movements were slower but deliberate. He rolled his shoulders, reached for his canteen, and then walked back toward the Colonel and Calvin, with grease-slicked gloves and a faint spark in his eyes. The diagnostics they've been running are useless, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone in particular. All surface level. They're treating this engine like it's a modern composite, when it's really a hybrid monster, half electrical legacy, half combustion brute. She doesn't speak binary. She growls in analog. Calvin raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to ask what that meant, but Colonel Abrams nodded with understanding, gesturing subtly for Jeremiah to continue. The control sequencing on the starter relay isn't standard anymore. Someone replaced the governor's override with a makeshift patch, probably during the last campaign abroad. That means your electrical pulses are either hitting too early or not at all. It's not a dead engine, it's an engine that can't hear the ignition call. So you're saying it's been alive the whole time? Calvin asked, leaning in, unable to help the awe in his voice. Jeremiah nodded. Sleeping. But badly wired. And nobody's been speaking her language in years. That was when he pulled out his own toolbox, one Calvin hadn't even noticed before. It was old, heavy, reinforced, and battered from years of use. When Jeremiah flipped it open, it didn't sparkle like the kits the Army mechanics used. Instead, it looked like a time capsule, filled with odd-shaped clamps, analog voltmeters with scratched glass, and wires color-coded with faded tape instead of factory labels. There was something almost reverent in the way he selected each tool, as if he were picking the perfect key for a lock only he understood. As he set back to work, Colonel Abrams turned to the mechanics still hovering nearby. "He works alone from here. No distractions, no second guessing." The others nodded silently and withdrew, leaving only Calvin nearby at a respectful distance. The air grew quieter, the yard echoing now only with the occasional rustle of paper or creak of shifting metal. For the next 2 hours, Jeremiah performed what could only be described as a methodical operation. He didn't just reconnect wires, he removed and replaced them with freshly crimped lines from his own stash, insulating them with strips of leather-like material he explained came from old airship insulation sheets. He rewired the ignition matrix entirely by hand, eliminating the aftermarket patchwork that had clogged the governor system. He even rebuilt one of the solenoids on site, using nothing but a torch, solder, and components pulled from what looked like a 30-year-old alternator coil. It was around this time that Colonel Abrams returned from a short briefing and found Calvin still watching in fascination. "He hasn't stopped," Calvin said. "It's like he knows every piece by instinct." The colonel gave a slow nod. "It's because he doesn't see just the parts. He sees the machine as it was designed, maybe even better than the men who built it." Then came the final moment. The sun was beginning its slow descent toward the west, casting long orange shadows across the yard as Jeremiah stood back from the tank. His hands were raw and blackened from oil and heat. He wiped them on his faded jeans and tossed the last rag onto the workbench. Then, with a breath that seemed to steady even the surrounding air, he climbed into the cockpit. The other soldiers began to quietly gather again, drawn to the moment like moths to flame. Calvin stood just behind the engine bay, his heart pounding louder than he expected. The colonel, silent as ever, had his arms folded behind his back, his eyes fixed firmly on the machine's front. Jeremiah flipped a few switches, ran through a sequence of buttons, then held his hand above the ignition switch. For a brief second, everything was silent. Then he pressed down. The engine gave a short cough, then another, louder, deeper. A low growl emerged from its belly, rumbling up through the metal until the tank quaked slightly on its treads. Then, with a sudden roar that sent a shiver across the concrete, the beast came to life. The sound wasn't smooth or clean. It was raw, guttural, and full of history, but it was alive. Running. After weeks of failure and confusion, the tank engine was running. A collective gasp passed through the yard, followed by scattered applause, disbelief, and the widening of eyes. Some of the younger mechanics who had doubted him most stood slack-jawed, mouths parting as if they had just seen a ghost. Calvin turned to the colonel. "He actually did it." Colonel Abrams didn't smile. He simply nodded once. "I knew he would." The workshop fell into a weighted silence as the tank's engine hummed, alive, at last, but in a tentative, irregular pulse, as if even the machine was aware that it was operating on borrowed time. Leon stood beside the chassis, hands resting on the metal like a doctor feeling for a heartbeat. Around him, the other mechanics stared in reverent silence, and for once, there was no scoffing, no laughter, no dismissive glances. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the engineer, who had come out of nowhere and seemingly revived a machine that had mocked their best efforts. But Leon wasn't basking in triumph. His brow was furrowed, not in worry, but in concentration. He knew this was only the beginning. The tank had spoken, yes, but what it said wasn't entirely comforting. The engine had started, but it was groaning, telling him that something deeper still needed to be addressed. It had life, but it was flickering. The compression ratios were off. The sound of the piston suggested carbon buildup. There was a distinct rattle he didn't like, possibly from the camshaft, or maybe worse, the crankshaft bearing. Leon turned to Colonel Barnes and gave a simple nod, the kind of nod that didn't mean success, but progress. Barnes seemed to understand instantly. He stepped forward, clapped a firm hand on Leon's shoulder, and signaled the others to clear the area. The mechanics reluctantly stepped back, forming a wide circle, unsure whether they should intervene or simply bear witness. With sleeves rolled up and a small toolkit beside him, Leon got to work again, not with the enthusiasm of a man trying to prove something, but with the solemn diligence of someone nursing a wounded soldier back to health. He opened up panels that hadn't been touched in years. He cleaned valves with a gentle but efficient motion. He adjusted timing belts with micro-level precision. Hours passed, the sun dipped low, and the workshop's large halogen floodlights flickered on, casting harsh white light over the gleaming armor of the tank. No one had left. The mechanics, despite themselves, remained in place, no longer to critique or compare, but to learn. A quiet transformation had begun. Leon didn't speak, but every move he made spoke volumes. When he removed a fouled spark plug, he didn't just throw it aside, he inspected it, showing its blackened tip to a nearby technician, who now watched with the wide-eyed intensity of a student in awe of his teacher. When he flushed the oil system, he narrated softly, not to brag, but to explain the why behind the what. One by one, the others began to nod along, their earlier cynicism evaporating like steam off a hot manifold. Barnes stood at the periphery, arms folded, lips tight, eyes gleaming. The other Zoll. He wasn't just watching an old friend fix a tank. He was watching him fix a team. Hours turned to nearly a full day, and eventually, Leon stepped back again, wiping his hands on a rag so stained it was nearly black. He gave a tired sigh and motioned for the ignition. The same young corporal who had failed earlier hesitated, then stepped forward. Hands slightly trembling, he turned the key. The tank engine roared, not coughed, not sputtered, roared to life with the confidence of a beast awakened from deep sleep. It idled steady and true, no misfire, no grind, no warning lights. Just power, just purpose. The group erupted, not with whoops or applause, but something deeper, a collective exhale, relief, respect, and for some, quiet shame. A few men who had mocked Leon the day before now hung their heads slightly, as if realizing how much they still had to learn, and how easily they had dismissed someone who should have been revered. Leon, however, didn't gloat. He nodded to the corporal, gestured toward a checklist on the wall, and said simply, "Run her through the test protocols." The young man obeyed, this time with more confidence. Barnes walked over and offered a mug of coffee, lukewarm now, but still appreciated. Leon took it and sat down on a nearby crate, finally letting himself feel the fatigue that had been trailing him like a shadow all day. He wasn't smiling. Not yet. There was still more to do, but the wall had broken, and in its place, something better was forming. As the tank continued its smooth purr, mechanics leaned in, not to question, but to ask. Real questions, curious questions, respectful ones. Leon answered each, never brushing them off, never lording his knowledge over anyone. He remembered what it was like to be young and uncertain, eager to learn, but too proud to ask. Now he had the chance to change that pattern. Barnes watched it all unfold and allowed himself a small smile. This had been his gamble. Bringing Leon wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about repairing a culture, restoring pride not just in equipment, but in the men and women tasked with mastering it. Leon didn't just repair engines. He reignited purpose. He taught without lecturing, led without demanding. And perhaps most importantly, he showed them all that age wasn't a weakness, but a library. A library of scars, lessons, and wisdom. one that had waited patiently for someone willing to turn the page. The engine's roar cut through the morning air like thunder rolling across a prairie sky, and for a moment, everyone on the base, mechanics, soldiers, officers, stood frozen, caught in the awe of something that had refused to come alive for weeks, now roaring with a vengeance. It wasn't just the sound of pistons and power, it was the sound of redemption, of memory, of old glory brought back through sheer force of will and know-how. The colonel stepped back, eyes wide and gleaming, as the massive war machine hummed steadily beneath them, almost like a living creature that had finally woken up after a long slumber. Beside him stood the man who made it happen, Warren Macklin, the retired Army engineer, his silver beard streaked with oil and his coveralls bearing the stains of long-forgotten battles. But this time, it wasn't enemy fire he had conquered. It was time, rust, and a stubborn piece of machinery that had stumped every modern expert they could find. The day had begun in frustration and doubt, but now it ended in awe and quiet respect for a man long removed from service, yet clearly not forgotten by the machine he once commanded. As the tank rumbled in place, the thick scent of diesel and heat rising from it like steam from a boiling kettle, the colonel put a hand on Warren's shoulder, not in formality, not as a superior officer, but as one soldier to another who had just witnessed something exceptional. The story of the Phoenix tank and the retired man who brought it back from the dead began spreading beyond the base. Military blogs picked it up. A few local journalists wrote features about it, interviewing the mechanics and capturing grainy photos of Warren standing beside the now operational giant. Veterans groups posted about it on social media, calling it a testament to the irreplaceable wisdom of the old guard. Even an official from the Department of Defense reached out to the base, requesting a report and offering commendation. But Warren didn't care about the buzz or recognition. He'd stayed on the base a few days longer after the fix, checking in on the tank daily, cleaning up the workspace, even helping the younger mechanics understand the modifications he'd made. He declined the colonel's offer to reinstate him in some honorary advisory capacity. He said he preferred his quiet life back in Prescott, working on model airplanes and fishing with his grandson. But he left behind something bigger than any medal or plaque. He left behind belief. For the mechanics, Eddie, Travis, Maria, and even young Dawson, this wasn't just a technical lesson. It was a reminder that experience wasn't just about what you could read in a manual or watch in a training video. It was about touch, instinct, humility, and patience. Warren had shown them how to listen to the machine, how to approach it not with the arrogance of a fixer, but the respect of a craftsman. The workshop, once cluttered with scattered tools and frustration, now held a sense of discipline and pride. They even hung Warren's old service photo on the wall near the toolbox, right under a hand-painted sign that read, "When in doubt, ask the guy who's seen it all." Colonel Hastings, too, had changed. Known for being stern and by the book, he began placing more trust in intuition and legacy. He started inviting retired officers and engineers back for talks and mentorships. He encouraged his team to document not just procedures but stories of how things were done in the field, under fire, or with little to work with. His leadership softened without weakening, and that made him respected even more. He often retold the tale of the Phoenix tank in officer briefings, not as a technical report, but as a parable about persistence, forgotten wisdom, and the value of honoring those who came before. Back in Prescott, Warren returned to his routines. The tank-sized gaps in his days were now filled with letters from soldiers who'd heard his story, invitations to military reunions, and even a request from a defense museum asking if he'd be willing to consult on restoring a Cold War-era vehicle. He politely declined the more public invitations, but agreed to help out at the local Veterans Center, mentoring younger mechanics who wanted to learn from a real master. And every now and then, when the Arizona sun dipped behind the mountains and the day cooled into silence, he'd step into his garage, run a hand along the gleaming side of his old Chevy pickup, and smile, not because of pride, but because he knew, deep down, that some machines only come to life when someone truly listens. Months later, the base held a formal dedication ceremony for the Phoenix tank. It wasn't flashy. There were no brass bands or camera crews. Just a simple plaque placed beside the vehicle that read, "For Warren Macklin, whose hands woke the heart of this beast once more, your wisdom rides with us." Eddie gave a short speech. Maria handed Warren a wrench that had been polished and engraved with the date of the fix. Dawson, now fully trained and newly promoted, saluted Warren with tears in his eyes, grateful not just for what he had learned, but for the kind of man he hoped to become. And as they stood there, in the golden light of a setting sun, surrounded by steel and history, the sound of the Phoenix tank revving one more time echoed across the tarmac like a promise that nothing, not even a forgotten engine, is truly lost as long as someone remembers how to bring it back to life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.